although we can use CSS to have some interactivity on our page, if we really want our websites to be interactive, you need to have some kind of JavaScript. JavaScript is object-based, and we'll talk more about that as we progress. It's a client-side scripting language, so it happens on the client side. Remember, not on the server side. We talked about that in a previous tutorial. And it is a loosely typed language, which we'll talk more about later. JavaScript allows us to manipulate the objects on our web page document. We can manipulate things like the window, the document, and then elements inside of our document like forms, images, hyperlinks, etc. To understand JavaScript, you have to first have a basic understanding of the document object model, or the DOM. Again, I'm introducing you to some things in this tutorial, and we'll dive much deeper as we get into JavaScript. But the document object model is basically, we need to think of the components that make up our web page as objects in and of themselves. And if we can address those objects, if we can tell JavaScript how to get to those objects, then we can change those objects. So this is just a hierarchy chart. We have the window, the browser window. Don't worry about history, location, and navigator. We'll look at that next semester. We want to look at the document. The document is where all of our HTML is located. And we could have anything in that HTML. We may have an anchor, we may have a form, we may have an image, we may have other types of hyperlinks. But in there, we can also have attributes. There's an attribute of that image called source. There may be elements inside those forms, and we can change those things if we can get to them. But we need to understand that those things exist in a hierarchy. So what are we going to do with JavaScript? We can do things like display message boxes. We can select list navigation. We can edit and validate forms. We can create new windows. We can have image rollovers. We can manipulate the date object, or we can do calculations. There is, because JavaScript is so widely used, there is a library of free sources called Jquery. And that's supposed to be a lowercase j, but this wouldn't let me do that on this particular PowerPoint. Jquery, think of when you go to the library and you check out a book. It is a library of code. It is out there and available to you, and as you learn more about being a web developer, you can just go and check out that code, and you don't have to redesign or redevelop everything. There's things out there that are common that you don't have to code on your own. This is Jquery's website, so you can feel free to Google it and download information. There's also information on their APIs. API is short for Application Programming Interface. That's a protocol, which means a series of rules that allow software to communicate with each other, so they're able to interact and share data. Okay? Now, this is not all that exists out there when it comes to web design. There's also something called Ajax. Ajax is not a single technology, but a combination of asynchronous JavaScript and XML. And it allows you, again, to manipulate things in your website. We are not going to work specifically with Ajax, but as a web developer, this might be something that you want to do. So in this code, basically, they're using Ajax code to change the content. So when I press this button, the content of this website changes, and that was through Ajax. Now, Jquery does have APIs, but there are other APIs that are used on the internet. There are things like geolocation API that gives us a way to interact with geolocation kind of on the back end so that we can easily use it in our website. There's also things like web storage, offline applications, and even a canvas element that you can use to draw. And that canvas element is what kind of helped us move away from having Flash solely, like we were able to use Canvas to basically do what we used to do with Flash. While we're talking about APIs are used a lot in programming because it's a way for, like, if you wanted to create an app right now that interacted with something that Google had, like say Google's Gmail or Google Docs. Google has a list of APIs, and when you go to their APIs, they tell you in this information how to interact with what they've created. So in this case, I think I'm on Google Docs' API. So if you wanted to create something to interact with Google Docs, this website would show you how to do that. It gives you samples, references, so like how do you change the background state, where's the footer, where's the header, all sorts of information is provided in those APIs. So it's not important that you know how to do that right now. This whole explanation was just to introduce us to some of those things that we're going to start hearing about as we become more skilled in being a web developer. Okay, so let's create our very first JavaScript example. And this content shouldn't make a lot of sense right now, and that's okay. I just want to kind of introduce you to it, and then later on I'll kind of walk you through understanding the components of what we're doing over the course of the next few weeks and next semester. Okay, create a blank document called date.html, and then I just use the keyboard shortcut to input the content, and then I have example JavaScript. Okay. Now, JavaScript, remember with CSS, we included script elements, and with CSS, we included style elements. We could have a style element in our head section for embedded CSS, or we could have an entirely different file saved as .css for external CSS. The same goes for JavaScript. We can have a script tag set in our HTML document for embedded JavaScript, or we could have external JavaScript saved in a separate file as a .js and then linked to our file. Okay? So in this case, we are going to add some script tags. We're going to do it right in our HTML. Later on, we'll learn more about why we probably shouldn't do it this way, but just for the purposes of this tutorial, we will. Okay, so in the body, I created an H2 and said today is, and then we closed the H2. In between our H2 today is, we'll create a script tag set. And it did not close my script tag set because it's a little confused because it's in HTML. Normally you would have your script tag in the head section or right before the body closes. We'll talk about it later. Okay, there we go. We're going to create some variables. Variables are not exactly like they are in math class. Variables are just a storage location in memory. We'll talk more about it later. And we are assigning each variable a value. Okay, so let's talk about what this code means. A date is an object within our DOM, and we have to create a new instance of that date object in order to work with it. We store it in a variable called myDate. Now that we have that, we can use certain methods to access information about that date object. If we say myDate.getMonth, it returns a number between 0 and 11. Sometimes JavaScript, for lots of different things, and lots of different programs do this, they start counting at 0. So actually January is 0. So to get the correct month of this being November, it would return 10, so we add 1 to it. So now we have a variable that will, right now on today's date, be storing 11. Here we are using the getDate method to get the day and getFullYear method to get the year. We use a document.write method And then we are returning the value of the month variable. We are concatenating, we'll talk about that later, a slash concatenated with the value of the day variable, concatenated with a slash, concatenated with the value of the year variable. So if we run this in our browser, it returns today's date. And if it was tomorrow, it would return the 7th or the 8th or the 9th. If you're doing this not on the 6th, you should see the today's correct date. So like I said before, don't get too panicked if you don't understand what all of this does. We're going to baby step through learning about how to create variables, give them values. We'll learn more about different built-in methods like .write. We'll learn more about the document object model. Those are all things that we're going to cover in the upcoming weeks and semester.